Hi, this is Metropolix from Intellijel, the follow-up to their popular Metropolis sequencer. It takes the same core idea, a sequencer where not all the stages are the same duration, and expands on it in multiple different ways. Is it the ultimate melodic brainstorming tool? In this video, we'll take a look at everything it can do, including its pros and cons compared to other sequencers. More of this jam at the end of this video. Before I start, a quick disclosure, Intellijel sent this over for review. It did cost me, but much lower than retail, and as always, they have no say over the content of this video. This channel is funded by viewers who subscribe to my content and book updates on Patreon, YouTube Premium or ads, and store affiliate links in the description which help the channel regardless of the product you choose to buy. Let's dig in. Okay, let's start with an overview. The stars of the show in the original Metropolis module were these long switches that let you change the stage length, called pulse count here, and the stage modes. These redefined what a Eurorack sequencer can be. The sliders represent quantized pitch, that's pretty much commonplace. But the pulse count switch means that a voltage level, or note per stage, no longer represents a single beat, but rather up to 8 pulses or steps. The pitch played by a slider is quantized to the scale of your choice. The gate type switch complements this by letting you easily change the stage mode from a single note to a note repeat or arrest. What this means is that an 8-stage sequencer can effectively manage sequences up to potentially 64 steps long, though with certain limitations of notes repeating or playing for durations longer than a step. And you can break through these limitations with the mod lanes. We'll talk about that in a bit. Now, since your pattern can easily stray out of a 4x4 or other traditional bar lengths, if you're not into polymeters, both the original Metropolis and Metropolix have the ability to limit the total step or stage count of a pattern using the length parameter. So if I absolutely insisted to only have 8 counts, 8 pulses per pattern, I could do that and it would stay in sync with the beat. I could do that, of course, in multiples as well. But I think a lot of the beauty of Metropolix is to let the patterns be as long as they want to be. Now, these 3 lanes aren't the only lanes you have per pattern. The original Metropolis lets you edit slides and skips. So say if I wanted to have a slide at this step or between these 2 steps, I could do that. I could also skip steps. So let's say skip these 2. You can add ratchets both here and in the original Metropolis as well. So let's say I wanted to add a ratchet to this step. I would just go into here and then use the encoder to change the number of ratchets on that step. Once you're in the edit mode for the particular lane type, you can go to any step and edit that step individually. You could edit multiple steps by holding Alt. There are a few more similarities between Metropolix and the old Metropolis, but Metropolix takes the original concept and expands on it in quite a few ways. Here are what I think are the most important ones. First, you get 2 melodic tracks instead of just 1. Now, these tracks don't start out entirely independent because by default they share the same slider and switch positions, but all their other properties like playback order, speed, length, or basically anything else are entirely different, and with a few tweaks and tricks you can decouple them completely. I'll explore how that works a bit later. So for example, another track has been running in the background all this time. We've been messing with track 2. If we take a look at track 1, we can edit that. Let's just listen to it. It's running through Atlantis here. And you can see they sound pretty similar, except maybe for the skips. But I could say, for example, change the clock divider of track 1 and make it slower. Or change its play direction. Say, let's make it go backwards. So Yeah, and if we maybe increase the tempo a bit, you can see they're doing two separate things. And now it's up to us to explore these and make them obviously melodically interesting. Anyway, more on this later. The second way that Metropolix has been improved is that the tracks contain much more information per stage, not just slides, skips, and ratchets. These labels represent these additional lanes. For example, there's another CV track in parallel to whatever's going on here. You go into Edit, then choose the track you want to edit. Let's say CV track in this case. Then, just like we did before, you can choose the stage you want to edit and change its CV value. And there are a few smoothing options here, ramp options, which you can apply, by the way, to all the steps. And you can send this control voltage out either one of these two outputs. Another interesting new lane is probabilities. So this is our pattern. All probabilities start at 100%, but if I wanted, say, this step to not play at all times, maybe just at 50% of the times, then I could reduce its probability. Same goes for obviously any other steps. We'll talk about the accumulator lane, which is super interesting a bit later on, and the pitch and gate lanes represent an ability to disconnect the pitch of a track from the sliders and to override the default gate settings for the track. Anyway, back to my list of top major improvements in Metropolix. The third big one is the additional mod track that runs in parallel to tracks 1 and 2. Now, this mod track is actually 8 different lanes of modulation, which you can assign to one of, think around 30 different parameters within the Metropolix sequencer. And you can have each of these different mod lanes impact either just track 1, and let's go here, just track 1, track 2, or tracks 1 and 2. We'll go over this in detail in a bit. Let's just stick to the overview. The fourth big improvement in Metropolix is that you can save your musical ideas in up to 64 preset slots. So let's say, for example, that I really felt strongly that this idea is a good one, and I wanted to maybe play with some more knobs and sliders, but I didn't want to lose it. I could just go ahead into saving a pattern, which you go into using the Alt and save. Then you choose one of 8 different banks, which have different colors. Let's say go to the blue bank, and then I simply choose the step where I want to save this pattern, and it's saved while the pattern is running. I could go ahead and change things. And if I thought this was good, I could go ahead, go Alt, save. I could have saved just from that page. Anyway, save it into slot 2. And if I thought this was horrible, I could always go into Alt, load, and load the original pattern, which still works regardless of the slider or switch positions. And then finally, for what's new, many other little things have been expanded or improved upon. There's a new OLED screen, which gives you a lot more information that's easily accessible. The control knobs are now configurable, and there's an additional modulation input, again, configurable using these buttons next to the knobs or next to the inputs. There's an optional expander with additional functionality and plenty of other options lurking underneath if you're willing to explore a menu or two. So that's it for what's new. Let's take a look at the layout and how you use Metropolix. I'll start with these stage buttons, which I've been using quite a lot. So you've seen me use them to edit different lane parameters using the edit button and to access alternate functions that are labeled above the buttons using the Alt button. So to load or save presets, A and B let you edit what goes out the CV outputs. And just to keep going with this example, clock lets you edit what goes out the clock output, and MX configures the function of the expander. Quite a few options here for how the expander works, what it sends out. And beyond that, these buttons have additional functions when you're editing different track parameters. They work sort of as shortcuts. So let's say that I'm editing the track length. I could choose the number of stages by turning this knob, or just hold length and use this as a shortcut. Same goes for the second parameter here. Quickly jump between different pulse counts. And in other cases, these also let you save snapshots. So let's say, for example, I found a particular play order that I like and direction that I like. If I hold order and say long press this, it'll save this option as a shortcut, and to load shortcuts, you just jump one by one. Let's reload this shortcut. And in loopy mode, they also have additional functions. So you could use them to loop a step or loop a range. And when the clock isn't running and you're in loopy mode, you could play different steps individually. And then I think I didn't miss anything. The last thing is that when you hold the loopy button, you can also use these buttons to mute different mod lanes, which again we'll talk about in a bit, or mute tracks while we're here. So that's it for the stage buttons. Moving on to these buttons, they're grouped by color. These are transport controls. These are different track parameters, and these are overall settings. When you see two rows on screen, you can toggle what you're editing by either pressing this button and then using the encoder to change the parameter in certain cases. In some cases, there's just one parameter, so that's easier. And then in other cases, you might find that pressing this changes the bottom parameter, while turning it changes the top parameter. We've sort of in passing covered the function of all of these, but like I mentioned earlier, you could set a different play order out of multiple different play orders and play direction. Track lengths let you determine length either in stages or in pulse count. Divisions let you set the overall clock division, or basically relative speed, for the track, and a clock divider for the multiple pulse steps. So let's say, for example, choose a step and give it multiple triggers on repeat mode. So if it's set to /1, you'll just get 8 repeats here. But if we change that to, say, divide by 3, you'll get rhythmically interesting subdivisions, not just repetitive, monotonous repeats. Swing is swing, that's easy. Slide lets you choose both slide amount, and there are a few slide options. Acid/303 style is a nice one. Then gate controls the overall gate length in the pattern. And gate scaling lets you scale that overall. Scale lets you choose an overall global scale, or in major scale. That's for the quantization of these sliders. So we just moved this to, let's go for plenty of scale options here. It may not be so evident for this pattern, but there's a lot to choose from. You could also set the root node for the scale. Tempo is straightforward. Setup gives you a bunch of global settings. I'll go through some of these later on. And then the Alt button also gives you alternate parameters, sort of like a right click for the different tracks. So remember I said these sliders, for example, span 3 octaves by default. If I wanted to change that, I could go into Alt, Track 2. And then there are a few track specific options here. Transpose is easy. Slider octaves, let's go ahead and see what that does. So forward, stretch these out. So a bottom note, a high one would be 4 octaves apart, and I could change it to just 1 octave apart. If I wanted a finer resolution, and then I could always transpose the pattern like this. Yeah, there's certainly a lot to explore here. I won't go over all of these. The manual is great, by the way, very detailed, so you're welcome to take a look at that. Continuing the panel tour, like I mentioned earlier, these 2 knobs and these 3 inputs are configurable. So let's say that I wanted to have this knob control, let's say, octave plus minus, right? Question mark means you need to press the encoder to make the setting. And then I can control either track 1. In this case, I'm using track 2, so I want to control track 2 and not both. Again, question mark, hit the encoder. So now I could use this to transpose the pattern. There are a bunch of destinations for these inputs too, and if there's nothing plugged in here, you could use this motion back and forth to control gate style parameters. So if there's a long line here, it means it's not a gate parameter, but say the accumulator is a gate parameter, and let's maybe look for, say direction. So I could now use this knob to change the pattern direction, and I want to impact, track 2. Okay, so now it's going backwards. I can make it go forwards. So you can control gate parameters with these knobs. If nothing is patched into the inputs, if something is patched to the input, they act as attenuators. In terms of additional I/O, each track gets its own pitch and gate outputs. There's a clock input and reset if you want to sync this to external clock, or if you've got a MIDI to CV converter, you could use that to sync to external MIDI. And like I mentioned, these two outputs are totally configurable, and here you've got a few clock settings which you access here. So that's the overview. Before we dive in to take a closer look at a few features, let's take a look at the setup. I've got Metropolis here controlling two voices. Track 1 leads into Atlantis, and track 2 goes into Bifaco's Lich with a harmonic oscillator. Atlantis is a full 2-oscillator voice, so you don't need any envelopes, VCFs, or VCAs. Everything's included. That goes into this module by Mountainking Electronics. It isn't released yet, it's just a beta. I use it as an attenuator. That then goes into Performer, which gives me multiple effects, including reverb, delay, note repeat, and a compressor. This goes into the mixer. The second voice, like I mentioned, is Lich, going into disting for both a VCA and ASR envelope in one. That's sort of this half. Then that gets patched into a drive, which goes back into a DJ style filter for this half of disting EX. Finally into this delay, into level control, and into the mixer. I've got clock going out of Metropolix into a mult, a buffered mult, and split out to pretty much everything. So this delay is timed, this delay is timed, and then another clock goes into Temps Util, which I use as a simple drum sequencer, going into Queen of Pentacles, also with a stereo output into the mixer. I didn't patch R-bar because I didn't want too many cables in the way, but this is a great way to provide additional texture that you can have as a send effect going out of any one of the tracks, capture that, and then play back into the mix. The last piece of the puzzle is the run output coming out of the expander, which resets the patterns on Temps Util. You don't need the expander for that. You can use one of these outputs to send a run signal as well. You just won't be able to use them for something else. So you'd go into Alt, edit either A or B. Let's say go into A, choose run for that, and then I'll get a run signal here. So that's the overall setup. If you want to get a bird's eye view of what's going on inside in Metropolix, you've got 4 home screens. These give you a nice indication of the number of steps and skipped steps on the 4 tracks, the notes on a per track basis, the slider positions if you've loaded up a preset and the sliders don't match to what they are in the preset. Same goes for the knob positions, and the outputs of the 4 mod lanes and these 2 outputs. So let's dive in and talk about the mod tracks. For this, maybe let's mute track 2 and go into track 1. So this is our pattern, simple one. So the mod track really isn't a mod track, it's 8 different mod tracks, each totally independent, and each of the mod tracks can impact one parameter out of around 30 parameters in the sequencer. So let's go and say edit mod track 1, and let's go for something that would be easy to recognize. Let's go for octave. So we're going to have mod lane 1 modulate the octave of this pattern. And we're impacting only track 1, which is good. That's what we want. We're in track 1. So these are the steps. The pattern itself can be any length of steps. Let's maybe shorten it just to 1 step. Okay, so 1 step pattern that's repeating itself. And then let's go into the step and edit it. We've now transposed this pattern 1 octave. So let's get it back to normal, and let's make this maybe 4 steps long, and then take the 4th step and transpose that 1 octave. Okay, so that's transposing the 4th note. And if I were to go into clock divisions and go to, say, a 4th, then I'd get 3 patterns, that are similar, and 1 that's transposed. I could reset this so they get back in sync, and now I'm transposing 1 in every 4 repetitions of this cycle. So we've got 8 of these lanes. Let's say that I wanted to edit lane number 2. It's unassigned right now. Let's go ahead and assign it to, let's say gate length in track 1, which is good. I can go ahead and edit its parameters. So maybe increase this one. So we're getting a longer note. Every so often I can make this shorter to make that happen more often, or out of sync, so only 5 steps. Steps and stages are the same with mod tracks because you can't have multiple pulse counts per step or stage. if pulses isn't set to auto, it'll force a mod track reset after a certain number of steps, as written in the bottom row. Yeah, and you can get way funkier than that. Let's go, for example, and edit. Yeah, let's modulate play order. Why not? We've got a linear play order overall. And yeah, anything goes if we want to edit this track. And if we slow this down to slower clock division, this is track 1, by the way. So you can see the play order being modulated. Anyway, a lot of opportunities for melodic and rhythmic exploration here. One thing you need to know about the mod lanes, at least as of the current firmware, they're not in sync with the pulse count or gate type parameters. So they run separately from patterns that have different pulse counts. You need to sync them up yourself. You can't just align them with the different stages of either one of the tracks. I have no indication of whether there's a firmware update coming that will change that. So for now, if you want the mod tracks to be perfectly aligned with your pattern, you'll need to sync pulse counts or pattern lengths manually. Let's show you one more interesting and quite powerful mod destination, skip invert. So up until now, we've been playing track 1 with 4 steps, and I could just go ahead and set it to an 8-stage pattern. And I could have gone in and edited it skips and played 4 steps that way. So that's our original 4-note pattern, but achieved via skips in not a short pattern length. So pattern length is 8. Anyway, the skip invert parameter is really cool because it lets you, let's go ahead and edit these. It lets you choose to flip the skips. So now when the mod lane gets to say this step, skips will be played and vice versa. Anyway, go to the track, reset. So it's going to repeat, and then flip the skips, and flip the skips again. So I can't pretend total control over everything that's going on here, and certainly mod lane modulations, especially when you use multiple ones, are a place to expect the unexpected, but I think it's an amazing additional layer to Metropolix. So that's mod lanes. Another topic I wanted to discuss is decoupling tracks 1 and 2. Like I mentioned earlier, they share the slider and switch positions unless you choose to disconnect one of the tracks from any one of these. Let's maybe just start up with an init preset. Let's see what happens. By the way, while we're here, there's a nice tuner option that plays both voices and lets you see if they're in tune. It's good enough for me. Anyway, so now both tracks are essentially doing the same thing. If we change a slider, it'll change for both tracks. Same goes for the pulse count and gate types. Now, the minute we start editing any of the track lanes or any of the track parameters, they'll obviously be decoupled, but they'll still share the same slider position. So how can you avoid this? One interesting way is to go split screen on both tracks. So if we go into edit, skips, and say for track 1, skip these 4 steps or 3 steps, then go into track 2 and skip these steps, we now have a sort of like split screen where track 1 is playing these steps and track 2 is playing these 3 steps. And remember, they're not steps, they're stages. So they can each have their different parameters, which is a mess right now. But if you take the time to organize things, then you essentially have a split-screened or split-view decoupled control of both Atlantis and Lich in this case. Now in this case, both tracks are still listening, quote-unquote, to the sliders and the switches. Let's mute track 2 for a second, go into track 1. Now even though you can do quite a lot with just 3 or 4 or 5 stages, what if we wanted 8 full stages for both of our synths or both of our tracks? Let's go into a 4-note pattern. We can also override any of the pitches using the pitch override function. So by default, when you don't see anything here, when it's a flat line, then we're playing the pitches as per the pitch sliders, but we can go ahead and override the pitch on a per step basis for 1, 2, or all of the steps. And these steps will then completely ignore the sliders. So now that we've overridden all 4 steps, the slider positions don't matter anymore. They can be whatever I want, and I could then go ahead and use these for track 2. Now, a few interesting shortcuts here. A long press on a step will delete it, and Alt long press will delete everything. So now we're back in sync with whatever these do. And sync is a fun feature, so I can brainstorm a pattern here. Let's say that I like this pattern. If I hit sync, it'll sync the step that I'm on and sort of freeze it. And if I hit Alt and sync, edit all, it'll sync all the steps, and now we're completely decoupled with one short step. So you can use these to brainstorm and then freeze the pattern, then go ahead to track 2 and change whatever you want. And it won't impact, as you can hear, track A because the values are frozen. Now in the current firmware, there's no way to freeze the pulse counts, so they will impact the pattern. But you can go into the track menu and then go into pulse count and disconnect it this way. So instead of switch, just go to 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or up to 8. Say go to 1. So now these won't impact track 1 in this case. And again, you're free to use these switches for track 2. This applies for the gate type switches as well. So if you wanted, you could disconnect the gate type switches. You could choose which of the types you want. And when you see a plus rest here, that's a fun little option that still lets you keep the rests. So it will take into consideration rests if you choose one of the modes plus rest. Okay, let's start an init preset again and talk about the accumulator. So let's maybe go back to a normal and simple pattern here. Go to simple gates. And again, choose a 4-note pattern to keep it simple. Mute track 2, use track 1. And then let's just maybe choose a simple pattern here. So the accumulator is one of what I think the most interesting new features in Metropolix. We've got this pattern. Let's go ahead and edit the accumulator. So what we can do is pick one of the stages and have that grow or travel gradually up or down the scale based on the number of degrees that we choose here. So let's say have it go up 1 degree. Maybe go 2 degrees at a time. Now if we hit Alt and limit, we can edit the accumulator limit. So right now it's 8 degrees up and 0 minus degrees. So I can have the note accumulate values across a more limited range. And because this travels across degrees of a scale, you're pretty much more or less guaranteed to have interesting musical results. Now by default, the accumulator works per stage. So say if I increase the stage to 2 steps long and enable repeats, we'll get the same note every time. But if I go ahead and edit the accumulator, I could change that to per pulse. So we'll get an accumulation every pulse. And we can also have this work on ratchets. So if I go to ratchets and enable ratchets for this step, you can get pretty crazy with this. So that's the accumulator, a very welcome generative feature. We talked about Loopy earlier, a great way to just freeze a certain step. Loopy will also freeze accumulations. So you can create interesting arpeggiated patterns that way. Loopy works on regions too. We talked about that earlier. Loopy also functions as a mute, so we can mute automation lanes, modulation lanes, or tracks. And I think one more important aspect of Loopy that I also touched on before, if a sequencer isn't running, then you can play individual steps. I see they don't accumulate, but audit stage is a great way to either perform live or to focus on a specific step. And another interesting aspect of this live play mode, if I go ahead, track 1, edit, skips, and just zero out everything, then when Loopy is active, I could play individual steps. So I could change them into holds and play individual notes. while the sequencer is running. So I could then go ahead into track 2 and then say activate, edit, skip there, skip these 4 notes. So now I've got these 4 notes in track 1 as a keyboard, and I can still run a sequence on track 2. Let's unmute it. So this is, lich over here. And I can then go ahead and back into loopy mode and play held notes. Here we go, into here. So with this little trick, I've got a split keyboard, so to speak. Track 1 playing on the left manually and track 2 running in the background on the right. The last topic that I wanted to touch was the preset system. So you can take everything you've got going on here, like I mentioned earlier, Alt, save that in any one of the colored banks, 8 banks, and 8 presets per bank. So saving an idea while you brainstorm melodic ideas is really easy and fast. So just experiment, and when you're ready, hit save and keep going. Make some changes. If you like what you hear, save again. Make some more changes. Again, if you like what you hear, hit save again. Easily go into Alt, load, and recall any one of these. Now, obviously, when I do that, the switch positions don't count anymore. So let's maybe go ahead and ruin this completely. Alt, save that here, and then go into Alt, load, and load this pattern. And now the physical position of the pulse count switches isn't relevant anymore, but if we go into the home screen, you'll see little dots next to each stage where the physical position of the slider or switch is different from the preset value. Now, by default, a preset saves all the slider and switch positions, but doesn't load them up. You change what gets loaded up in the overall global settings. If we go into preset setup, you can choose to have the pitch sliders load up or not. If you don't want them to load up when you change presets, same goes for the switches, and same goes for the control knobs as well. I choose to load these when I swap presets, but you can choose to have these fixed across all the presets. And if you sort of just want to go back to the panel and reset everything to the actual positions and eliminate all these dots, just basically long press exit, and everything goes back to whatever the switch positions or slider positions are on the panel. Okay, let's talk about the pros and cons of Metropolix. In terms of melodic sequencing without an onboard keyboard, this is the most hands-on Eurorack sequencer I've ever tried. Most sequencers have just one row of knobs, and even those that have 2 or more use the extra rows for parameters that are set alongside equally spaced steps. Here, the hands-on controls are musically relevant. They let you explore different rhythms along varying melodies in a very tactile way. Now, of course, as you start diving into other step parameters or lanes, the screen and shift functions play a bigger role, as they do in other sequencers, and here you do need to select the step and then edit its value using the encoder, as opposed to having, say, 8 encoders changing steps immediately. So it's not perfect. Its tracks aren't totally independent. Like you saw before, there are only 2 of them as opposed to other sequencers that have 4 or more. And yes, you can decouple the tracks like I showed you earlier, but when you do, they lose some of the features they had and the tactile control, which is the whole point, even though the split screen functionality that I showed you before is pretty unique. Also, Metropolix's tracks are inherently non-polyphonic. You can't sequence chords on a single track. You could, of course, sequence an external chord generator and control it with the CV lane, but that's a workaround compared to having a built-in chord lane. When thinking of Metropolix as a brain for a setup, it depends how many tracks you need. 2 melodic tracks may be enough, but if you'd like to sequence a third or need a drum sequencer, you'll need a companion module. Intellijel makes Steppy if you want to stick with the brand, and there are obviously plenty of other options for drum sequencers. You can, by the way, use the Expander module as a simple drum sequencer using different clock divisions, so it's not a custom per step sequencer, or there's no Euclidean pattern generator here, but it is if you want to get a basic pattern going. It would be nice, by the way, if they'd let you use the mod lanes as simple step sequencers. So that, together with different mod lane lengths and different mod lane clock divisions, could turn this, if they found a way to output the gates here to a pretty interesting drum sequencer. And the fact that you can save mod lanes per presets means that you could change patterns as you go through different presets. Finally, on the cons side, there's no MIDI output, at least not on the module as it currently is. I don't know if there's a planned MIDI expander module in the future. As a melodic exploration tool, though, it would be fun to hook this up to just regular MIDI instruments, or even, God forbid, a DAW. So who is Metropolix for? If you have a set musical idea in your head and want as many tracks as possible, there are other sequencers that are better suited for that. However, if you approach Metropolix with an open mind for a dialogue, whether you have an initial idea or want to develop one on the spot, you're in for a melodic and rhythmic treat. Setting different pulse counts, clock divisions, gate types, accumulators, mod lanes will all make you rethink where your melody starts and where it ends. And as you start cranking up the mod lanes and control knobs to change different parameters, you may start wondering who's in control, but I found myself reaching surprising results, and I mean that in a good way. The accumulator feature in particular is one of my favorites. I wouldn't be surprised if that gets copied in other sequencers in the future, just like the pulse count and length features were copied in others over the past few years. I think it would be nice if in the future they'd add the option to align the mod tracks with one of the two main tracks so that modulation changes stay in time automatically with pulse counts. Right now you need to align them manually, and if you don't, well, I guess that's just an opportunity for more melodic accidents, hopefully happy ones, which I know is kind of the point of this module, but it would still be nice to have the option to sync them up automatically. Now, the sheer number of mod destinations can certainly be overwhelming initially. The manual describes them pretty well, and once you get over the initial shock, to me, that's where the real magic of this module lies. I don't think that the 8 stages is a limitation. There actually is a track out swap option, so if you want, you can sort of chain tracks this way, so to get even more than potentially 64 pulse counts. But I actually think, frankly, that working in split screen with just a couple of short patterns and finding the right balance between them, like hopefully I did in the intro and outro tracks, is a lot more interesting. One more reason I think these aren't that intimidating is because once you start modulating 2 or more of these parameters, you're not really in control. Not to mention when you start messing with different length and divisions for the modulation lanes. So you need to be the kind of person that this kind of melodic brainstorming fits within your workflow. And if you are, I think that's the whole point and charm of this module. So that's it for Metropolix. If you'd like to explore plenty more Eurorack and other electronic music ideas, tips, and tricks, check out my ever-expanding book, available to the good people who support this channel on Patreon. Hit like if this was useful. Don't forget to ring the YouTube bell if you want to make sure you don't miss the next one. Thanks for watching.